Chapter 12. I'd taken a bus, a commuter train, and then finally a taxi to get back to school by noon. I wanted to get there in time for civics, the class before lunch. I signed in at the office, told them I had an appointment, and then headed off for class. I got there late, but still got there. I quietly slipped in the door. Mrs. Watkins was writing on the board. She looked over and gave me a disdainful glare. She continued writing and talking. The only open seats were, of course, in the front row. Was this going to be my new seat? Nice of you to join us, Mr. Blackburn, Mrs. Watkins said as she turned away from the board. Sorry I'm late. I was just finishing up my interview, the one you want to do. With the soldier? Retired soldier, special operations. Excellent. So please tell us what he said. Give us an oral report. I was taken aback. I hadn't seen this coming. I thought I could write something up and hand it in. Slowly I got to my feet as Mrs. Watkins took a seat at her desk in the corner. What was I going to say? Where was I going to start? I interviewed a gentleman who was a sergeant in the armed forces. His name is Jack. He said he was stationed at bases around the country, but that he was also part of missions around the world. I reached down and grabbed my notebook I'd used. I used the train ride to finish transcribing my notes into it. He was in the military for 24 years. It was sort of like the family business. His father was in the military and his grandfather. Jack said that he felt like he was doing the right thing, defending our country and trying to help people. He was part of United Nations peacekeeping missions in different countries like Haiti, Bosnia, the Middle East, and Rwanda. Rwanda, Mrs. Watkins said. I didn't know there were any Canadians in Rwanda. There were eventually over 40 countries that sent soldiers. There weren't many Canadians, but some. The commander was a Canadian during the genocide. The genocide, Mrs. Watkins said softly as she stood up. Does anybody know what a genocide is? Isn't that when a lot of people get killed? A girl answered. In most armed conflicts, people get killed. We consider it an acceptable part of war when those who are killed are the combatants, the soldiers. We consider it far less acceptable when innocent civilians are killed. The term used today is collateral or casualties. That basically means that they were killed because they were in the wrong place and were killed as one set of soldiers attempted to kill soldiers on the opposing side. With a genocide, the death of civilians is not accidental. The civilians are targets. Genocide is a methodical, deliberate attempt to kill civilians, especially those of a particular group or specific ethnic, religious, or racial group. Like the Holocaust, somebody said. We'd studied the Holocaust in grade 8, and I didn't think there was anybody who didn't know at least something about that. I'd even read a couple of books, sort of historical fiction, about kids who were in the Holocaust. The Holocaust was one act of genocide, Mrs. Watkins agreed. In World War II, the Nazi parties, under the direction of its leader, Adolf Hitler, decided to kill all persons who were Jewish. Men, women, small children, old people, babes in arms were subject to a systematic attempt to annihilate an entire group of people. While there are some debates concerning the exact number, it is without question a fact that at least 6 million Jews were killed. They were shot, electrocuted, killed with explosives, and in the best-known example, slaughtered by the use of gas in the concentration camps. It's so hard to believe, another girl said. What made them do that, act like that? What made them so full of hate? If it was just the Nazis, it would be one thing, Mrs. Watkins said. The Holocaust is the and best-known genocide in the 20th century. But it was not the only, or the first, or the last. Mrs. Watkins took a sip from her cup. In a period between 1915 and 1923, there were 1.5 million Armenians killed. The entire landmass of Asia Minor was expunged, all Armenians. There were either killed or forced to leave, and many of those forced to leave died of disease and starvation. Who killed them, somebody asked. Turks. It was a genocide against Armenian Christians by Turkish Muslims. But how could that take place? Didn't somebody try to stop them? Jeremy asked. At first, nobody even noticed. It wasn't like today with mass communications and satellites and internet and CNN, Mrs. Watkins exclaimed. And when it was discovered, there were so many other things going on with World War I. And then there were confusion about who in fact should or could intervene. That was a long time ago, somebody else observed. It was? How about killing fields of Cambodia? Mrs. Watkins asked. Wasn't that a movie, Kelsey asked. It was. A movie about the genocide in Cambodia in the 70s, when the Khmer Rouge movement under the command of Pol Pot killed 1.7 million people. That was over 20% of the total population of the country. Even that was a long time ago, the same girl said. It makes me feel old to realize how long ago you think that was, Mrs. Watson said with a half smile. Then there was Yugoslavia. The mass graves are still being discovered today. The final account, the number of different people of different groups who were killed in that genocide is still unknown. Probably never will be. And then, most recently, there was the genocide in Rwanda. Ian, do you know anything about what happened? I know the numbers, I said. 800,000 people were slaughtered. One girl gasped. Nobody else even blinked. It was like they didn't hear me or didn't believe me or didn't care. And do you know when that took place, Mrs. Watkins? It happened during 100-day period in 1994. That can't be right, a voice at the back said. We would have heard about it. It did happen, Mrs. Watkins said. This soldier, Jack, you said he was there? I nodded my head. He was there, but he told me it was hard even for him to believe it. He told me about people being attacked with machetes, about rivers being clogged with bodies, other horrible things. I could tell by the expressions of a couple of the girls in the front that they were upset or disgusted. Do we have to talk about this? A girl asked. We don't have to talk about anything, Mrs. Watkins said, but please explain to me why we should talk about this. Well, it's just so gross. And upsetting, another girl added. Maybe that's why we should talk about it, Mrs. Watkins said. I remember hearing a minister say that the best thing a sermon could ever do is comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable. I think it's important to know about the world around us, the larger world beyond MTV and the mall. She took another sip from her mug and then turned directly to me. Ian, is this soldier a friend of the family? No, I just know him. How do you know him? Mrs. Watkins persisted. I really didn't want to answer, but I didn't have much choice. I know him from the soup kitchen. Does he do volunteer work there too? She asked. No, he eats there. He's a street person? Mrs. Watkins asked. Yeah. He's a bum? Jason squealed and then started to laugh. You got all your information from a bum? He lives on the street, but he's not a bum, I snapped, and you better shut your face right now or I'm going to... Mrs. Watkins instantly at my side as I started to get out of my seat. She stepped in front of me, heading me off. Nobody is calling anybody anything. I want an apology now. I'm sorry, I didn't mean nothing, Jason mumbled. Good. Nobody was to call Jack a bum? Or, now your turn, Ian, Mrs. Watkins said. My turn to what? To apologize. Nobody is either calling somebody names or threatening to harm them. That's how wars and genocide begin. I mumbled an apology. But how far does somebody go from being in the armed forces to being a street person? A girl asked. That's not as far a fall as you might think. People in all walks of life can end up on the streets, Mrs. Watkins said. Alcoholism and mental illness don't discriminate between people. The biggest difference between those who overcome and those who succumb isn't the person who is afflicted, but the people who surround that individual. The supports that allow them to heal and regain their equilibrium. Some people are just lucky enough to have somebody there to help them. You know, somebody, it only takes one person. She took another sip from her coffee. Does anybody know what groups Hitler targeted before the Jews? There was no answer. The mentally ill and the homeless, she said. They were the first people he sterilized, rounded up, and exterminated. He was allowed to get away with that, so he moved on to the next group. Who knows how history would have changed if there had been a national or international reaction, outrage. Maybe he never would have cemented his power. Maybe World War II never would have happened. But who was going to object to his actions? It was just a bunch of crazy, homeless people. Maybe not worthless, but certainly worth less, she said, echoing the phrase from the last class. Mrs. Watkins took another sip from her bottomless cup. I wanted to say something, but I just didn't know what to say. No one else seemed to know what to say either. The whole room was deadly silent. There wasn't even the sound of shifting feet or shuffling papers. Nothing. Did anybody here drop off flowers in memory of Crystal? Mrs. Watkins asked. A half-dozen girls put up their hands. Crystal was a 9-year-old girl who had been abducted, sexually assaulted, killed, and her body dumped in a park by the lake. It had happened a half year before. It was awful, just awful. I could so clearly see a picture of her, at least the photographs of her that had been played in the papers and on the newscast. At the spot where her body had been found, people had started to drop off flowers and stuffed animals. These people, most had to be strangers, came and cried, then left. I'd seen it on the news. It had become a virtual garden of flowers, a mountain of stuffed animals. Did any of you girls know Crystal? Mrs. Watkins asked. They all shook their heads. Why did you bring flowers? She asked. I brought a teddy bear, one of the girls said. Fine. Why did you bring anything? Mrs. Watkins asked. I just wanted to say how sorry I was, the teddy bear girl replied. Yeah, so the family would know that people cared, added another. How about you, Cindy? I don't really know why I did it. I just to try to, I don't know. This is going to sound stupid. It won't, I'm sure. Just say it, Mrs. Watkins said. I just wanted to do something kind to try to make it better, she said. A small act of kindness, of goodness, to try to counter the evil that was done, Mrs. Watkins said. But it wasn't like I could fix it or make it better, Cindy said. You're partially right. You couldn't fix it, but you did make it a little better. A random act of kindness often sends ripples that have a positive effect, Mrs. Watkins said. I saw her mother being interviewed. She said she was thankful to all those people who had dropped by, another girl said. I was wondering, did anybody think about giving flowers for the 800,000 people who were killed in Rwanda, Mrs. Watkins asked. We didn't even know about Rwanda, Cindy said. You do now. You already knew about the Holocaust and the millions killed. I've now told you about 1.5 million in the Armenian died, and the 1.7 million who were victims of the Cambodian killing fields, and the tens of thousands killed in the ethnic cleansing in Yugoslavia. But you can't grieve for these countries' victims because they are just a number so large it can't be comprehended. She swirled the coffee in her mug but didn't sip from it. One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Does anybody know what that means? I do, I said. The death of Crystal is a tragedy because we know her. At least we feel like we know her because we can picture her. We know about her family, we've seen her mother on the news crying. But the million people, we don't know them, so we don't care about what happened to them. A million is just a number, a statistic. Perfectly said, Ian. But each of those million was a living, breathing, feeling human being, each as much a person as Crystal, and as long as they remain unknown, separated from us by time or distance or situation, we don't have to know them. They remain a statistic. The entire room was so silent that I could hear the ticking of the clock hanging on the back wall. Does anybody know who said that, Mrs. Watkins said. You, right now, Jeremy joked. Mrs. Watkins let out a deep, long sigh. Does anybody know who originally said it? It had to be like Plato or Socrates or some old-time Greek philosopher, or maybe Shakespeare. He was always saying things like that. Or maybe Mark Twain or Joseph Stalin, Mrs. Watkins said. Who's that? He was the leader of the Communist Party in Russia. Under his orders, millions upon millions, his fellow Russians were executed, she paused. Millions and millions. He knew enough to make sure they were only statistics.